Thanks, everybody. It's 2 o'clock.
All right, so thank you guys for joining us today. We're going to be talking about the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, key messages and policy details. So here's who we are. There
we go. And I'm Rick Knight. I'm the one on the left, in case you're wondering. I'm a research coordinator working for Danny Richter, our VP of the government policy and of research as well. And my colleague, Jerry Hinkle, is here in the audience somewhere. So we're the two research coordinators that work with Danny. My background is in chemical engineering. I'm now retired from that career, working in energy research for 40 years. And now I finally graduated into my dream job with CCL.
All right, and I'm Lesley Beatty. I'm CCL's Director of Marketing, and part of my job is to make sure that we have together the set of messaging at the highest level that makes us successful when we're out talking about the Energy Innovation Act to all of our different audiences. And so a little bit about what we're going to do today. The first thing is we're going to review the key messages of the Energy Innovation Act. We're going to talk about some new ways to bring those messages to life. So there are some new things around messaging that have never been seen before, but will be premiered in this room to see how they work. And so I'll be asking for feedback for that. And then the last very important part is that Rick is going to tell you how the policy works so that you can understand that and understand how it supports the key messages. Yes, we will make the presentation available. Yeah. And I should say there's a lot of, this will be a reasonably interactive presentation. There's a lot of time that we have carved out for Q&A. So we will have plenty of time for questions, and we'll take them section by section. All right, so are you ready for a big bipartisan solution to climate change? Yes! Okay. Did you want to talk on this?
Okay, so this is the list of our sponsors so far, unless more of them were added in the last 2 days, which I don't think I know. We have 41 sponsors from all over the country. Our lead sponsor was Ted Deutsch from Florida, and his partner on the GOP side was Francis Rooney, and there were 6 original sponsors altogether, and then we've added all these since then. And they're from all over the country. They're all across the ideological spectrum, mostly, almost all Democrats, but it still covers a lot of ground. There we go.
Okay. So how many of you have seen this slide before? Okay, great. So today what we're going to do is we're going to take each of these talking points basically one by one and dive down into them. So we'll spend most of our time on the top 3. So effective, good for people, and good for the economy. We will also cover bipartisan and revenue neutral, but a lot of how the policy works, details will go to support the first 3. And then we will also touch on sort of all 4 elements on this slide. So we'll talk about the carbon fee, the carbon dividend, the carbon border adjustment, and the limited regulatory adjustment. So all of those will be taken up. Okay, so this policy will reduce America's emissions by at least 40% in the next 12 years. That's the talking point. So what does that mean? Is that good? Is that enough? We have a lot of questions, and so today we're going to bring that to life a little bit and help set the context for what does that actually mean to reduce emissions by 40% in 12 years?
So we created an animated chart showing how the emissions specified in the bill compare with some other scenarios. Well, for example, if nothing changes, business as usual, our emissions in the U.S. are forecast to remain flat or even increase a little bit, so about 1% more than they are today or in 2020, as best we can estimate. Under the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, they would go down by 40% in 12 years, as Lesley said, and 90% by the year 2050. Who's familiar with the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Probably about half of the audience, and their recent reports. So here's how this policy compares with what they've recommended for 2 degrees C and for 1.5 degrees C. So as you can see, the bill's targets are well below the 2 degrees C target that used to be considered the standard, and fairly close to the 1.5 degrees C target. Well, what about the Clean Power Plan? Let's take away business as usual and replace it with the Clean Power Plan. If that were to be restored, our emissions in the U.S. would still remain relatively flat, only drop by about 3% by 2050. That's because the goals of the Clean Power Plan were pretty modest to begin with and have nearly been met by the closing of coal plants just due to natural market forces. So it's pretty clear that this bill is far more powerful than the Clean Power Plan, as you can see when we remove all the other material. So any questions then about the emissions charts?
Yeah, I mean, one of the questions I have is, I can see the impact being very big on the electricity sector, you might say, the utility sector. It's less obvious on the transportation sector. Can you talk about that?
Okay, the transportation sector, in most of the economic models, it's not very well represented because they use historical data on how people respond to changing gasoline prices and how manufacturers respond to what they see in terms of demand. But nobody has ever seen how consumers and manufacturers are going to respond to a look forward of prices going up X number of pennies per gallon every year for the foreseeable future. So most of the economic models and the economists will acknowledge that the models don't do a very good job of capturing what the transportation sector is going to do. And plus, you'll see that these are required under the Act, these targets. So, Peter? This is not modeled. This is actually what's required by the bill. Okay, and we'll talk about how those requirements are going to be enforced as we go along. And one more question. Let me say this about the Green New Deal. What do you think would happen if the Green New Deal was passed by both houses of Congress and signed by the president into law? What would happen the next day? Nothing. Because the Green New Deal, we are very happy that the Green New Deal has really energized the conversation on climate change, but it's not a policy. So the Green New Deal says we should reduce emissions by 2030 by some amount, but it doesn't say anything about how we're going to get there. This is a policy that actually gets us there. Two more questions. One gentleman in the pink.
Methane included in this?
That's something I'll talk about a little bit later. It's yes and no is the answer. It depends. And up in front. What's that?
The CFCs are not. Are the CFCs included in this?
The CF? Oh, yes, they are. And I'll talk about that.
So can you talk about the difference between the schedule and the hard cap?
And the hard caps.
Schedule and a hard cap.
Actually, they're the same thing.
They are.
They are. And we'll get into that. We better move on because we want to stay on schedule.
Okay, so the IPCC and Clean Power Plan are two ways to bring this to life, but I would imagine that all of us find ourselves talking to people at one point or another who haven't heard about the IPCC recommendations or don't know what IPCC stands like. And so we're looking at some other ways to bring this messaging to life. And so 40%, is that a lot? Yeah. It's as if all of the transportation in the US was made zero emissions within the next 12 years. So that's every car, train, truck, plane, and boat were to stop emitting greenhouse gases. And in fact, the transportation sector makes up 29% of the US greenhouse gas emissions. So actually it's well over making transportation zero emissions. It would also be if you added agriculture and made that zero emissions. In addition to this, that is the impact it would have just in 12 years.
And this is yours too.
Or, so this is important, this is an or, it's not an and. If all of American electricity were made zero emissions and all of our homes and buildings stopped emitting greenhouse gases, that would be equal to that. So just to create the electricity we use in America is 28% of our greenhouse gas emissions. There's an additional 12% that goes into heating our homes and businesses, as well as how we dispose of waste. Okay, or it's also the impact of decarbonizing these two countries. Well, you could pick other countries, but Japan and Brazil, if they were to entirely decarbonize in the next 12 years, it would have the same impact. Or for those of us who long for a simpler time, this is Rex. He's super happy.
Does anybody remember who these guys are?
You guys, Rick made me test this, but I think it's a winner. It's like rolling back the clock to America's 1963 carbon emissions levels. So that's when the Beatles were singing I Want to Hold Your Hand. It's the same year that the zip codes were introduced in the United States. The average cost of a home was under $13,000. But lest we pine for a simpler time, I remind you it was also the year that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated, and it was also the March on Washington. So things were still complicated back then, but it would be like rolling back the clock to our 1963 levels of emissions within 12 years. All right, so I want to take a moment now to ask you what resonates with you, because we may not use all of these things. So I told you guys you were going to see some things that were new today. And I want to know if any one of these or which ones of these feel like you would like to use them. All right, so just show of hands. The transportation. Mm-hmm. All right. Homes and businesses. Okay. Other countries? All right.
Not so much.
And the Beatles. And we like that. All right. Rick's going to take over my job as marketing. Okay.
I think 1 and 4 pretty much tied for the winner there.
All right. Thank you for that.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about why the policy is effective. What's the basis for making all these claims? First of all, the carbon fee section of the bill, it's section 9902, for those of you who want to know. How does it work? It puts a price on every metric ton of fossil fuel carbon, which means the carbon in coal, oil, or natural gas. So what exactly is a metric ton? It's 1,000 kilograms, or about 2,205 pounds, a little bit more than what most people think of as a ton, about 10% more. So in written materials, we use the abbreviation MT, but I may just say ton, and that means metric ton. So it puts a price on every metric ton of fossil fuel carbon, starts at $15 a ton, and goes up by $10 a ton more every year. And so it would be $15 in year 1, $25 in year 2, $35 in year 3, and so on. But take note that since not everyone here is a chemist, the carbon fee, and this has caused some confusion for some volunteers, it's not $15 per ton of carbon. It's $15 per ton of carbon dioxide or the equivalent emissions in global warming potential. So that designates the amount of global warming effect that will be produced when the fuel is burned. Okay? And like the footnote here says that that comes to about 3 2/3 tons of CO2 for every ton of carbon in the fuel. So the carbon in the fuel is what's actually measured. Now, the bill does have some exclusions for farms and the military. And these have obvious political importance. So we're not going to hide that fact. But there are non-political explanations for them as well. And I won't go into that now, but in the Q&A, if anybody wants to know. And it should be noted that this only accounts for about 1% of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So it sounds like more than it really is. The bill also provides a carbon fee refund for CO2 capture and sequestration, and I'll get into that because it has its own section in the bill. So by covering all fossil fuels that are burned for energy, the carbon fee covers at least 91% of net U.S. greenhouse gas emissions, and possibly more, depending on how the rules are written after the bill is passed and how technology advances for quantifying things like methane leakage that we're asked about. Now let's look at another related provision, the fluorinated gas fee. These substances are used in air conditioners and refrigerators and for other industrial purposes. And they're potent greenhouse gases. And when I mean potent, I mean a CO2 equivalence in the tens of thousands in some cases compared to CO2. Some of you might remember a substance called Freon. And it was at a time when refrigeration was done with toxic things like ammonia or flammables like propane. They came up with this magical chemical called Freon that was neither toxic nor flammable. Unfortunately, they found out that it was killing the ozone layer that protects us from ultraviolet radiation and could have severe effects on people, animals, and plants. So they replaced them with these other magical chemicals that did not kill the ozone layer. And wouldn't you know it, they turned out to be very potent greenhouse gases. So now that whole process is taking place again to replace those with other chemicals. But the federal government does have a program to keep track of how those gases are emitted. The emissions are already reported under federal law. So that gives us a basis for putting a price on those F gases, as they're called. So there's a special fee, and it has its own section in the bill. So a fee similar to the carbon fee is applied, but it's only imposed at 10% of the so-called global warming potential. The obvious question, which I'm sure some of you are thinking of right now, is why 10% rather than 100%? And the answer is, again, political. Because the feeling was that, for example, the most widely used refrigerant gas to replace Freon would be bearing a $21,000 a ton fee, which would cause people to freak out. If it's $2,100, maybe less of a freak out. And the reason we think this will work, or I should say we, I mean, the bill sponsors as well, is that in the country of Spain, they have already imposed a carbon fee on F gases, which they imposed at only 2% of global warming potential, and they found it was very effective. So 10% we expect will be as effective as 100%. So this F gas fee covers an additional 3% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. 3% is not much, but this is a very rapidly growing sector because people all over the world are getting into air conditioning and refrigeration where they weren't before. So, that's correct. GHG, I'm sorry, is greenhouse gas emission. The question was, when I say GHG emissions, it's CO2 equivalent, and that's what it is. So that would bring us to about 94% at least of net U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So let's see how this emissions fee rises over the years. It looks kind of like a stairway because the fee escalates on January 1 of each year and then stays the same for the year and goes up the following year. And this graph assumes that it stays at $10 increase every year, which may change, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So, and also I would point out that the blue line shows what the fee would be in non-adjusted dollars, so not adjusted for inflation, but actually with inflation at the expected level of about 2%, it would look like this. So by 2050, the carbon fee would, in inflation-adjusted dollars, would be about $615 a ton, which would be the equivalent of about $315 in today's dollars. Hold the question until we're done. Now, let me tell you something featured in the bill that goes beyond CCL's original policy, and then we'll take questions after that. I call these guardrails, but in legislative language, it's Section 9903, the Emissions Reduction Schedule. It's also referred to as the Environmental Integrity Mechanism, or EIM for short. It contains two provisions to be sure the policy is as effective as it needs to be. First of all, emissions targets kick in starting in 2025 to be cut by 5% of 2016 emissions each year. And I'll explain and show you in a graph what that actually means. So these targets function kind of like caps, although this does not mean we're turning this into a cap and trade mechanism. It has some of the benefits of a cap without all the complexity that comes with a cap and trade policy. So those of you who might hear about the 9903 table, that's what this is. So what happens if the emissions don't stay under these caps? The first thing that happens in 2025 is that a trigger would ratchet up the fee from $10 a ton to $15 a ton for every year that we don't stay under those cumulative caps. So that means at the end of 2025, we have to be 5% below 2016 emissions. By the end of 2026, it has to be 10% below those, and so on. And if that doesn't work in 2030, if we're not staying under those EIM caps, the EPA will be obligated to issue regulations to make it happen. The bill doesn't specify what kind of regulations, it's just that the EPA will have to do it. And this regulatory mandate will continue to apply every year afterward, as long as those caps are not being met. So that means also that all restrictions on EPA enforcement of greenhouse gas regulations are eliminated. And here's another look at this table, exactly as it's written in the bill. This is the actual, whoops, what happened? Okay. Exactly as it's written in the bill. And here's what it looks like. Here's what it looks like in a chart, okay? 2025, 5%, 10%, 20%. It goes down like this, the caps, and then it changes to a 2.5% per year. So that gets us to hit that 90% target. Now, some people find this confusing. They say, well, you're not doing anything until 2025. Why is that? Well, the carbon fee actually starts in 2020, according to the way the legislation is written. And emissions will start going down immediately. So, for example, according to the REMI study that was done in 2014, this is what that emissions drop would look like, and it sort of converges with these targets. So if things go as we expect, we'll stay under the cap. And after that, then there may be some additional steps needed. So I want to show you where these two guardrail policies fit into this. Okay, so this is the carbon price guardrail, which happens in 2025, and the regulatory guardrail, where the EPA is obligated to start enhancing the policy if needed in 2030. I think I'll stop here because there's a few questions. The gentleman in the striped shirt.
It's probably not a good answer to this, but I just want you to sort of riff on it. Congress is very good at passing these kinds of rules on itself, and they're very good at waiving them, as they do on the budget and on other things. So how do you have any sort of response to that or ideas on how to respond to it? Where, if the policy's effective, then great. But
Yeah.
if it's not effective, do they end up just waiving these rules?
Well, I don't know, you have an idea. The question, I'm sorry, we should have this microphone here, so for future questions. Okay, the question was, what if Congress doesn't do what they're supposed to do and they waive these rules? Well, you know, I mean, we have to believe in our democracy, and we vote people out of office if they don't do what we want them to do. But hopefully the bill is written in such a way that it's very difficult for that to happen.
So with the regulatory guardrail, there's not any stipulated criminal prosecution or anything for offenders?
Not so far, not in the bill, but that certainly could be done in the rule writing phase. So let me, okay, one more question. Take a lady way in the back there so we don't just only get the people in the front.
Thanks. I didn't understand. Is the 2% inflationary increase written into the bill?
No, it's not. It just says that it will be adjusted for inflation, so whatever it happens to be.
Like by the CPI or something?
Right, it follows the CPI. Okay, let me move on right now because we want to stay on schedule. I'm going to talk about Section 9906, which is carbon capture and sequestration. The bill does not, in general, dictate or even suggest what kinds of technologies should be used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, but it does facilitate this one broad category of solutions. That's because a ton of CO2 that's locked away underground is just as good as one that wasn't emitted in the first place. Now, these methods already exist, and whether they'll be cost-effective or not remains to be seen, but the bill is written to give them a fair chance to compete with other measures. So they get a refund of the carbon fee that was paid when the fuel entered the economy. So as long as it's captured and sequestered in a manner which is safe, permanent, and in compliance with local, state, and federal laws. And the EPA also must account for losses due to imperfect storage technology. So a couple of things. The refund is based on the fee that was paid when the fossil fuel was originally assessed. Why would you do that? So that somebody doesn't mine coal, put it in a big pile, wait a couple years, and then burn it and sequester the CO2 and make a profit because they're getting a refund on a higher fee. So they can't do that. They only get the refund for what happened when they mined the coal. And the second bullet about the imperfect storage technology, we don't want somebody to say, hey, let's capture CO2, stick it in a hole in the ground, let it leak out, go out of business, get our money. So they can't do that. The EPA has to, and this is where the question of criminal penalties could actually play a role, because the EPA does have a criminal enforcement authority over some of their rules under the Clean Air Act. So it could very well be that if somebody tries to get away with this, they could be in line for criminal prosecution. Now, I think that covers it here on this one. Oh, okay. Just one last point. The CCS refund is also available for permanent sequestration in a product like a carbon fiber or a polymer that doesn't get burned. So that same refund is available in that case. Let me see if we're at the... I guess we'll have to take a couple of questions because the hands are going up. Let me start with somebody who had their hand up for a while, the gentleman in the beard there.
I see our farmers were exempt from the pricing. Would the farmers be able to buy on carbon capture, since some of our most effective techniques for carbon capture will be with enhancing our soils and stuff. Is there a mechanism
Yeah.
for that?
The technology just does not exist to assess carbon capture in soils right now. It's just not practical to give people a carbon fee refund when the permanence or effectiveness of that is so uncertain. So we certainly would like to see policies that would make that would facilitate that, but they may have to be done in other ways. So, Jim?
Maybe I'm jumping ahead here. Wait. I may be jumping ahead, but because carbon border fee adjustment is next.
Right.
But I've never been clear on whether or not we've always said that our enactment of this type of legislation is going to provide strong incentive to other countries to act likewise. Is that in any way figured into the reductions that or are we looking at basically just what happens from our legislation?
Yeah, the legislation and the targets and the legislation only apply to the U.S. I'm going to move on because we're falling a little bit behind time and talk about the carbon border fee adjustment because that gets a little complicated. Okay, so besides the question of what is it, you may be asked, why do we need it? And there are two parts to answer that question. It avoids putting American industries at a trade disadvantage. We don't want the carbon fee to make our industries non-competitive on the world market. And second, it prevents what's called carbon leakage. Now, that term does not mean gas leaking out of a pipe. What it means, it's a trade term, which means energy-intensive industries moving overseas to avoid the fee, thus the carbon leaking across the border. Okay, so the second question that's often asked is, what products does this apply to? And it would be impractical to assess a embedded carbon fee on every product that crosses our border. So there are what are called carbon-intensive goods, and these are goods that, according to past legislation, are 15% of the value is associated with fossil fuel use, and 5% of the product value is exported or imported, exported actually from a U.S. company. So that's most likely where it's going to be assessed. And under the bill, the product list starts with the following: iron, steel, cement, paper, aluminum, glass, chemicals, and ceramics. And other goods may be added depending on how market conditions change. So that's the general framework in the bill. And let me show you how it works. Let's say we have two countries, the USA and call it Carbonia. And they have a border between them. Now let's say an American, this fella here, wants to buy some steel girders. So he goes to the steel mill and he buys his steel girders and then he pays the going price. Now the problem is that if the mill has to pay a carbon fee to cover their higher energy costs, they have to raise their prices to stay profitable. And over here in Carbonia, they don't have a carbon fee. So Mr. Steel Buyer is going to buy the steel from Carbonia because it's cheaper. So to correct that, the carbon border fee adjustment makes him, the importer, pay a fee which equalizes the price. So the steel mill, so he's paying the same price for the imported steel as he would to the American steel mill. So that takes care of half of the story. But for the steel mill, they say, well, what about my sales to Carbonia? You know, the Carbonians, they don't pay a carbon fee, so they can buy their steel cheaper than I can sell it to them because I can't be profitable unless I charge the additional money for the carbon fee. So that gets corrected by giving them a carbon border fee adjustment refund so they can reduce their price and still remain profitable. So hopefully that will help you understand how this works in terms of trade. And I think at this point, it's 2:30, we should probably take a break for just general questions of what we've covered so far. Okay, let me start with George from Alaska there.
Thank you. I had a question about the $15 integrity adjustment. If we weren't meeting the goal, would it automatically go to 15, or would it go to some fraction, something between 10 and 15? Or
It goes to 15.
It automatically goes to 15.
Yeah,
okay.
that's the provision.
Okay. Thanks.
Gentleman in the second seat from the middle row there.
Hold on, one second.
Here comes
We're on
Mike.
track to become one of the world's biggest fossil fuel exporters now with fracking. So what prevents the fossil fuel companies from, if we reduce fossil fuel use in this country, just exporting more overseas?
I was hoping you wouldn't ask that question. Yeah, the CCL's original carbon fee and dividend did not allow that refund to go back to fossil fuel exports, but apparently that couldn't get into the bill, and it probably has to do with trade, WTO trade rules. You just can't advantage your domestic producer, even of a fossil fuel. So fossil fuel producers can get a border refund under this policy. And the one thing that we can say is that if, say, a country like China wants to import American coal instead of Chinese coal, because it's got a better quality or whatever, certain properties, well, they're just going to burn less of their own coal, and so it does not necessarily result in a net increase in fossil fuel emissions worldwide. But it's not a completely satisfactory answer, and I don't know what else to say about it. This gentleman up in front here.
I got an easy one. Hey, I'm Philip from Hartford, Connecticut. I'm wondering if we can get a kind of marketing name change on natural gas and have them instead just label it as methane. I think that'll help people understand.
Well, it is a naturally occurring substance, but wait, let me answer this gentleman's question. Well, I mean, it's not 100% methane for one thing. Natural gas can vary in composition, so it's not really technically accurate to call it methane. You can call it methane-rich fuel or something like that. And this young lady here.
I have a question going back a slide to carbon sequestration, and one about this. The offsets, Oregon is just about to pass a bill, the Clean Energy Jobs Bill, and in it there is a 6% offset allowance for verifiable and measurable offsets, which a lot of it has to do with forestry and in the soils and stuff. So would that be considered carbon sequestration, is my first question. And my second question is, if we had a president like the president we have now, I can see that this could be manipulated in a way to advantage Americans by making it an unequal, do you know what I mean, border adjustment, so that it would advantage us. How do we prevent that?
Wow. I like the easy questions. The one about forest sequestration, I kind of answered that before about soil sequestration. We don't have, the bill does not have a mechanism because it's one thing to measure something like sequestration for a research project, but to monetize it, that's a whole different kettle of fish, and that hasn't been determined yet. Now, on the second question, of course, how bills are written to prevent the executive from thwarting their intent is an important thing. Right now, you know, we have World Trade Organization rules, which the U.S. subscribes to, and we've tried very hard to make sure, and so have the bill sponsors, that we will be in compliance with WTO. Current administration, maybe not so much interested in that. But this is part of our democracy. We try to write legislation that can help to prevent that sort of abuse. I think we better move on because we're still falling behind.
Excuse me, can I address two of those questions? Because you're struggling with the answers. In terms of exporting our coal and our carbon base, we have a microphone for him if you can answer it. Only applies to countries that don't have a similar pricing. And the rest of the world. The rest of the world, the developed world, is also looking for a solution to this problem. So trading blocs like Europe will adopt similar fees. So the carbon border adjustment will not apply to them, and we won't export our natural gas. They will not get a refund on the carbon fees if it goes to a country with a similar pricing policy.
The gentleman has a good point that...
Also, well, number two, we are also a net importer. That's the current accounts deficit. So when you look at countries like China, they're going to be strongly motivated to adopt a similar carbon pricing. Otherwise, if you look at it from their perspective, everything they export gets slapped with this carbon border adjustment, which we get the benefit of. And you have to look, as a middle class grows in China, they're looking for solutions to their own pollution problems. So they're strongly motivated. So, and also when we talk about manipulation of the border adjustment, it only applies to countries that don't adopt a similar
let me address
adjustment.
this. And I didn't mention it in that this does only apply to countries that don't have an adjustment of their own. And there would be a formula to account for carbon pricing or similar policies in other countries that are our trading partners. And Danny would want me to say, too, that most of our trading partners are already adopting various forms of carbon pricing. So that would change the equation a little bit. Okay, I'm going to turn it over to Lesley for more on messaging.
Don't worry, he'll be back. We're going to talk a little bit about regulations. So before we talk about actually what happens to regulations in the Carbon Fee and Dividend Act, we thought we would set the stage with a little conversation just about regulations. And so regulations and fiscal policy are both trying to solve the same issue. And if you look at the issue of climate change in economic terms, what this is a failure of the free market, right? So pollution is not priced. So fossil fuels are cheaper than they should be, and so we use more of them than we should. And that's the fundamental issue. And then the question occurs, okay, how do we correct this? There are some people who say the free market will correct itself. And then on the other end, this is partly why government exists, to step in on issues like this. And so if you think government has a role to play in solving it, what can government do? Really it is, government can use fiscal policy, right, which is a tax, or the government can use regulations. Both of those things are different approaches to solve the same challenge. And some things to think about when you decide, or when we decide what to do is it going to be effective? One, we've been talking about that. Will it actually reduce emissions? Two, what is the cost of implementing the fix? Ideally, lower is better than higher. Can it be implemented without bias, or what is the bias that is implicit when you implement the regulations? And will those regulations evolve? So as things change over time, are your fixes still going to be relevant as new things emerge? Okay. So the Energy Innovation Act is fiscal policy, right? It's a carbon fee. It's broad, we've learned. It's one price applied across industries, and that one price drives cost increases that will change individual behavior, right? So it could be today, carbon is baked into everything we have. It's baked into the products we buy. It's baked into our food, and we don't really know that as people who are buying things, what the true cost really is. this system will reflect a more true cost, and so it will drive behavior. Regulations are more specific limits applied to specific industries, and goods or services may be restricted. And so it's worth mentioning that these two things can exist side by side. So in cigarettes, for example, there is a federal tax, there are state taxes, and there's often municipal taxes on cigarettes. There are also regulations around cigarettes that prevent the marketing and sale to minors. And so there are a bunch of things in play there, and they coexist. I did dig this quote out from a Philip Morris internal document in 1985. Of all of the concerns, there's one, taxation, that alarms us the most. While marketing restrictions on public and passive smoking do depress volume, in our experience, taxation depresses it much more severely. Our concern for taxation is therefore central to our thinking about smoking and health. It has historically been the area to which we have devoted most resources, and for the foreseeable future, I think things will stay that way almost everywhere. So putting a price, increasing the price of cigarettes decreases smoking. And that has worked in that industry. That said, there is an ecosystem of things that have been done to reduce cigarettes. Okay. We probably would not be able to effectively just regulate CO2, and here's why, right? It's everywhere, right? It's in the things we use to power our vehicles. It is in our electricity. It's in when we heat our homes. It's in the things that we buy. It's in our food. It is everywhere, and so effectively regulating it would be incredibly complicated. And so that's one of the reasons that the IPCC recommended a carbon tax, is that there's a lot of complexity. All right, regulations do make sense, especially when you can't measure the thing that you want to prevent. And also when it's so hazardous, you need to remove as much of it as possible, like mercury or other toxic substances that we just don't want any of, and we want to get them to zero. Okay, and so Rick just went over this, but we'll repeat it. So the Energy Innovation Act pauses a small number of regulations on greenhouse gases for 10 years. Okay, after 5 years, the scientists start to assess the effectiveness. So this is what Rick just showed us. And if the reductions in any year aren't meeting targets, the increase goes from $10 to $15 for that year. And then after 10 years, if the goals are not met, the bill requires the EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Okay. Why does the bill talk about regulations at all? Really, it is a compromise, right? So Republicans generally do not like regulations. Democrats do like regulations. This is a compromise. Democrats, the Democrat sponsors of this bill have agreed to eliminate a few small restrictions, regulations, to allow for the bill to prove itself. And if it is not successful, Republicans have agreed to full regulation after that.
Whoops. Yeah. Okay, so Lesley set this up nicely. I'm going to make a deeper dive into what's called the regulatory pause. So who out there has encountered objections to this from their group, from other organizations? A lot of people. From members of Congress even? Anybody has heard that from congressional offices? Well, I want to explain what it is and what it isn't. Section 330 of the bill is called Suspension of Regulations of Fuels and Emissions Based on Greenhouse Gas Effects. It stipulates that the EPA cannot enforce restrictions on fuels that are subject to the carbon fee if these regulations are solely based on greenhouse gas effects. In other words, regulations that are redundant to the carbon fee. And this pause, as Lesley just told you, lasts 10 years. Now, there's a lot of caveats here. I'll show you what's affected and what's not. First of all, what's affected is the Clean Power Plan. Remember the graph I showed you about what the Clean Power Plan would do if it went into effect. 3% reduction by 2050. And just to be clear, the Clean Power Plan is not a law. It's an executive action set of regulations. and it only affects the electric power sector and can be blocked by lawsuits right from the beginning, as it has been, or even reversed by a hostile administration, if that should happen to be the case. And current data show that its very modest goals are likely to be met without doing anything. So if people who object say, well, you're not going to be able to bring back the Clean Power Plan, good, because this is a hell of a lot better. Now, the other regs that are affected include some very technical rules for new or modified stationary sources, which mostly means power plants. So if somebody wants to build a new coal-fired power plant, they would not have to use greenhouse gas rules in their applying for permits. Nobody is building a new coal-fired power plant. They're all shutting down. So it really doesn't have much of an impact on the future. Now, here's what's not affected. Air pollution rules on all these corrosive or toxic pollutants that directly affect health. Not one change to those rules. Auto tailpipe emissions. The EPA can actually continue to enforce even greenhouse gas rules on auto tailpipes because they're not based solely on the greenhouse gas effects. The fuel economy rules, known as CAFE, or Corporate Average Fuel Economy Standards, are not affected by this rollback. So they stay in place. A methane leakage abatement program, which has been in place since 2015, is now being held up in the courts, but the EPA still has the authority to enforce that. The renewable fuel standard that governs the use of ethanol and biodiesel in motor fuels. Regulation of greenhouse gases from aircraft and off-road vehicles will not be affected by this pause, and regulation of black carbon, an important contributor to global warming apart from greenhouse gases. All of these stay 100% in place, are 100% allowed. Black carbon, the question from the front is, what is black carbon? That's actually very fine particles of soot that come mainly from diesel fuel burning in old trucks. If you've ever got stuck behind a bus and you wonder what is all that black stuff that comes out, that's black carbon. And as I think we've already made this point, if the carbon fee fails to meet those targets, all EPA restrictions are lifted, and the EPA is then obligated, not just allowed, but obligated to make up any shortfall. So this regulatory pause is minimal and will likely have zero impact on emissions. And as Lesley said, this is the nature of compromise. Members of Congress are accountable to all of their constituents, and any opposition from business interests could impede the passage of a bill that would have these huge impacts on greenhouse gases. So minimizing opposition from important employers in their districts and states is a good thing to help get this bill passed. So at this point, I think we're scheduled to take 20 minutes for a Q&A. Why don't you pick somebody?
I just wanted to clarify something you said earlier. This will be
I'm sorry, wait for the microphone.
So just to reaffirm what I thought I heard you say, this presentation will become available to us?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think it's being recorded too, so the video will be available.
Hey, Rick, have you personally encountered that objection, and how did you personally respond to the regulatory pause objection?
Yeah, I've gotten this question from volunteers around the country, and this is pretty much, I mean, the way I've responded is to emphasize how minimal it is and that it really doesn't affect very much. I think that one of the sources of confusion is some people confuse the Clean Power Plan and the Clean Air Act. There have been groups that have said, this bill is going to suspend the Clean Air Act. No, it's the Clean Power Plan. They're two completely different things. So I think just clearing up that confusion sometimes will help. Okay, this gentleman in the blue shirt here. Should take the microphone.
Thank you. I'm wondering why you chose the term fiscal policy rather than carbon pricing. since we're trying to avoid having people think of the fee as a tax, and since fiscal policy is usually about not just taxing, but the balance of government revenues against government expenditures. I think we ought to avoid the word fiscal. It's sort of wonkish anyway.
And maybe, Lesley, you can.
Yeah, sorry, I speak to that. That was my choice. I just wanted to put it into buckets. We're not going to call it fiscal policy. We'll still call it carbon pricing.
Okay. The gentleman has had his hand up for a while back there. Yeah, that fellow in the dark T-shirt there by the video screen.
Thank you. John Keller from Boston area. On the slide where you showed the benefits of this bill, I saw nothing about innovation. And when I give talks about this, I like to give talks where I'm not talking about managing deprivation, but transforming through innovation.
And you're going to hear about that.
Okay, but I think it
in
should
the
be
next section.
Okay, very well.
Okay. How about the gentleman all the way in the back by that column? Somebody's pointing at somebody else here. Yeah. Oh, okay. The young lady in by the column there.
So you mentioned an obligation that the EPA has to make up shortfalls with regulation. We're going to go back to that if we don't meet targets. And my question is, can we say, is it accurate to say that in fact the ability of the EPA to regulate greenhouse warming gases would be strengthened under this bill if we don't meet those targets? That the current way that this is structured doesn't obligate the EPA to take care of that, but that if we don't meet our targets, in fact, they will be obligated.
I'm wondering if you went to law school, because that...
No.
You're absolutely right.
Early childhood. Kindergarten.
But that, yeah, you're absolutely right. It does actually strengthen the EPA's hand in that sense. And there's some technical arguments that the EPA's authority has never really been affirmed in law, and that this would actually make that happen. So, this gentleman in the YouTube's shirt. Wait for the mic. I'm sorry, I'm picking the person farthest away from the microphone.
Well, I'm concerned about the EPA because they have political leadership that gets gored out by oil interests. And I don't know. I feel like perhaps the EPA needs to be managed by conscientious citizen organizations and not be political.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, Lesley, pick somebody.
Okay, I'm going to get this guy back here in the green. He's waving his hands. Also, I get to move.
That's what you get for sitting in the back.
Yeah. Right.
I'm lost and confused, and you may have lost me in supporting this. My understanding is that there will be no regulations of fossil fuel use for 10 years, where every minute goes by we emit more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And also I'm wondering if it will affect miles per gallon regulations. I'm confused why a climate organization such as ours would like to suspend regulating fossil fuel use for 10 years, and just to see if something works when we can't get the carbon dioxide back from the atmosphere. Thank you.
Right there are all the things that are not affected. Okay, and you see the fuel economy CAFE rules are not affected. So the only things that are affected are the Clean Power Plan, which, as I've demonstrated, is not a very effective policy, and some permitting rules for new power plants. All of the rest of this stuff under the Clean Air Act and other policies are not affected. So it's really a very, very minimal regulatory pause. Oops. Okay.
Thank you. There was mention earlier in the presentation about how if certain companies don't meet stipulations that the EPA would somehow hold accountability. Like, what would that look like? It seems kind of vague.
The bill doesn't specify, they're leaving it up to the regulators to decide what policies are needed. So I think, I'm just kind of freelancing here, but imagine that we're above the targets and the scientists determine that the reason is because we haven't seen enough reduction in the building sector. So EPA would be obligated to address that, say, okay, we have to address that by putting in place some program to reduce emissions from home heating or lighting or something like that, or in commercial buildings. So I think it would depend on where the shortfall is taking place. Let's go to the gentleman, right here in the front. Yeah, you. Check shirt.
So my name's Tom McCone from Berkeley, California. I've confronted actually some pretty strong resistance from the public health community, and I think we have to take it very seriously. Physicians for Social Responsibility, and a number of, and the trouble is it goes across from organization to organization. And they're still messaging that we're throwing the Clean Air Act under the bus. And we're not. But I think, some things to be careful of is they say, well, you're talking about compromising the Clean Air Act. And we're really not. So, for me, what I've learned is you really have to talk to them in the language and say, this is a Section 202 Clean Air Act, one tiny piece of one. So the Clean Power Plan was done under Section 202, which is way, way, way down in the noise. It's like it's saying we're not going to use this one section of the Clean Air Act. I think we have to work on that messaging for these types of organizations, because in the health community now, the hospital association, same thing. They came up to me and said, "We won't support your bill. We worked so hard on the Clean Power Plan. You're going to destroy it." So, I just want to throw that out there. That's part of our messaging.
Lesley, maybe you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I think that feedback is well taken. That messaging to the health community does need to be more rounded out. I agree with you there. I think, but there are two levels of messaging that are needed. And so the first one is when we talk about the bill, how to keep the average person who thinks regulations are good, how to make sure that they understand the scope of it. I think the health community has concerns that go beyond that, and so requires more messaging, and we will work on that.
Excuse me. I think we're all interested in reducing global emissions, not just USA emissions. And my member of Congress always throws that out. Why should we do anything when China and India aren't? Even though that's not true. So, so if you can address maybe a little bit how the bill would spur more global action, that would be great.
So my messaging response to that is, since when does America follow China and India, which I think is a legitimate response. I don't know, Rick, do you want to say anything about global?
Yeah, it's hard to come up with a way to respond when people are saying things that are just not true. But it's true that China is implementing a carbon pricing policy. It's been happening very gradually, but they are doing it. And China, it's important to realize that China is much more vulnerable to the effects of climate change than even the U.S. is. Sea level rise of a couple feet would flood about a quarter of their country. They would, it would be devastating. So they do care. It's just difficult for them to balance the political needs of getting energy to their poor populations out in the countryside with their concerns about climate change. But that's not a good answer, I guess. But to say that China and India are not doing anything, it's just not true. We're the ones who are not doing anything. And we are also responsible for historical emissions far in excess of China and India. I think we need to move on to get ourselves back on schedule.
Oh, all right.
So let's hold the questions for now. And we're going to talk about health and the Energy Innovation Act.
Okay, so we're moving on. So we started with effective. We spent a lot of time talking about how it's effective. We are moving on to good for people. Okay, so there's a couple components to good for people, and the first one is a healthier environment. The talking point for the bill is this bill will improve health and save lives through cleaner air quality. Each year, 114,000 lives are lost due to air pollution. And through 2030, this policy would save 295,000 lives. All right. Sorry, I'm going to get the clicker. Okay, so that's actually a lot of people. So we haven't talked a lot about, we always say this stat, but then what really does that mean? The annual deaths in the U.S. Due to ambient air pollution, which is the air pollution from burning fossil fuels, is about 3 times that of the annual number of deaths due to secondhand smoke. So it's not nothing, and these are entirely preventable deaths. Additionally, air pollution impacts our kids more than it impacts grown-ups physically. Around the world, children under the age of 5 regularly breathe polluted air. That includes 98% of kids in low and middle income countries and 52% in high income countries. And those are air pollution, PM 2.5 in excess of the World Health Organization standards. Okay, and it's not just lives lost, right? So it's hard to model these things, but there are a lot of health impacts that happen because of bad air. So there are 29,000 children's ER health visits in the US each year due to asthma, and 15 million lost adult work days prevented. This 2-degree policy would prevent 29,000 children's ER health visits and 15 million lost adult work days each year through 2030 because of better health quality. So there are a lot of impacts positive impacts that will come just through cleaning up our air by reducing burning fossil fuels.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about exactly why this policy is good for health, and I'll get into a little more detail of some of the health impacts that Lesley talked about. So what makes this policy good for health? And the clean air benefits that Lesley just talked about. Fossil fuels emit air pollutants other than greenhouse gases, and reducing their usage brings about these benefits. Lower particulates. These are tiny microscopic particles that can penetrate into the lungs, mineral matter that's not completely filtered out from burning coal, diesel fumes containing black carbon, other pollutants that actually form in the air from the pollutants that come out of the smokestacks. These all would go down. Sulfur dioxide, that's what causes acid rain, and it's also damaging to lungs. And it's been reduced quite a bit by using lower sulfur coal and putting in scrubbers, but there's still a lot of pollution from sulfur. Smog-forming gases. Who lives in an area that has ozone alerts? In a town that has ozone alerts, okay? This means nitrogen oxides, hydrocarbons, and carbon monoxide. These all react in hot weather and sunlight to produce ozone, which is what leads to those alerts and creates the need for stringent pollution control measures in the big cities. And all fossil fuels, including natural gas, emit these. Of course, coal is the worst. And volatile organics. These also contribute to smog and have other toxic effects, like in some cases increasing cancer risk. and mercury, lead, and other heavy metals that have severe neurological damaging effects, especially on children. These come, again, mainly from coal, even with the strictest pollution controls. So any climate policy that reduces fossil fuel burning would have major co-benefits of reducing all of these, even though they're not directly caused or directly related to global warming. And this is why a 2016 paper in Nature estimated that a 2°C climate policy would prevent these 295,000 premature deaths over the first 15 years that Lesley alluded to. On the other hand, climate change itself, even aside from those other pollutants, also affects health. And this legislation would bring climate health benefits. Fewer extreme heat waves, which can result in heat stroke, aggravate existing conditions, and even increase violent crime, according to some studies. Less intense storms, especially life-threatening tropical storms and hurricanes. Less flooding, not only coastal flooding from hurricanes, but less extreme downpours in any part of the country. And I talked about ozone, lower ozone formation. It doesn't want me to move ahead. Oh, there it is, lower ozone formation. So it's also exacerbated by higher summertime temperatures. Fewer wildfires. Who's from California here today? You may have heard of problems with wildfires. Well, there's a multitude of health risks associated with wildfires, not only having to leave your home or have it burned down, but just the breathing of the air pollutants that come from those uncontrolled fires. Pathogens, lower incursion of pathogens, largely from insect carriers that are moving further away from the tropics to areas where we haven't adapted to them, and also in our water supply. And finally, even food security, because keeping global warming under control would ease the stress on crops from extremes of heat, storms, and heavy precipitation. We've been seeing them in the Midwest this year. I live in Chicago, and people in the Mississippi River Valley have been really suffering this year from flooding, including the farmers. They have enough problems. This is a graphic from a 2017 book on injury prevention and environmental health. And I just show this because it sums up a lot of the interrelated health risks from climate change. So while researchers have enough robust data on short-term health impacts from localized air pollution, they can calculate the excess deaths and ER visits and so on. Climate impacts, like those listed here, have not been as well quantified because the impacts are not localized, so it's difficult to disentangle those impacts from other factors. And also because global warming is a gradual phenomenon that has only recently reached a level to where attribution science can attribute specific outcomes to specific events. So it's really a developing area, like flooding and heat waves and so on. But the fact that these effects haven't been quantified as well as those pollution effects doesn't make them any less real. And on the flip side, we can say with complete confidence that slowing down and eventually reversing climate breakdown will save lives and make people healthier. So we can stop for another set of questions on this section. Let's find somebody that hasn't asked a question. How about George? I forget your last name, George.
Thanks, Rick. George Kralovic from Annandale, Virginia. On the health issues and life saved, as I recall, I'm not sure I'm right, but pretty sure, REMI study showed 225,000 lives saved over 20 years. Now we've got a figure that's 295,000 lives saved over 10 years by a different approach. I'm sorry.
I think it's 15 years.
2030, yeah.
Okay.
2030, but the bill starts in
you're right, 10 years.
2020, right? So hopefully. So I'm confident with the REMI figure when people say, where does that come from? Tell us again where this 295,000 came from. It's if you're below 2 degrees C, I understand that, but who came up with that? What's our authority?
Sure, and that is the study that Rick just showed. So I'm going to pretend I'm Jerry Hinkle right now, unless you want to actually speak to it, Jerry.
Yeah, it was a paper in Nature, and I don't recall who the authors were. Oh, this is.
Leader in this area, and it's an updated study. And what it says is 295 by 2030. And then as of 2030, a policy very much like ours would save 36,000 lives a year, every year from there on.
I bet you didn't know there were 3 of us here.
Yeah, no, I've been
Jerry was
working in
Jerry Hinkle was the source of, I think, that reference to begin with.
Yeah,
Dan.
Did the 114,000 per year come from that study too?
Okay. Yes. So the 114,000 per year is from air pollution generally. And the second study I just cited is very, say again? To the mouth. Oh yeah, I thought it was a, okay, thanks. Yeah, so the 114,000 is from air pollution generally every year in the U.S., and then the 295 and then 36,000 a year, a portion of that is actually lives saved from a policy very much like ours. So Rick showed you a graph of the emission reductions to get to 2C, then ours, then 1.5C, somewhere in between. So what the Schindel study showed was the health co-benefits from a policy that would get you to a 2C temperature rise.
Here's the reference, and there's actually a link to the article there. I think it.
Unfortunately, that wasn't my question.
I'm not sure if it's behind.
I just was clearing up that.
Behind the paywall or not.
My actual question has to do with when you talked about the climate benefits and all the stuff with fewer this and fewer that. My understanding is that the climate benefits are going to accrue over a very long period of time because the climate's going to change to our benefit at a geological pace as opposed to a human timescale pace, and it'll take a couple generations because, like I know for instance the ozone, they passed the regulations on ozone in the late 80s, and it took 30 years before you started seeing the positive impacts of that. So.
Yeah, I wouldn't say the geological time scale. I think maybe in a decadal time scale, you'll see more and more impacts. And of course, it's a difference between localized impacts and worldwide impacts. Anybody else back in the middle there? Okay.
Can you please just clarify for me that if the legislation is passed today, the fee would start in 2020?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, thanks. Hi, I think earlier it was mentioned that there could be refunds of the fee for people who sequester some of the carbon that they emit. My thought is that it might be nice to have the same refund to go to people who who sequester carbon who didn't even emit the carbon in the first place. So people who sequester other people's carbon emissions.
I'm not sure what that. Oh, direct air capture. The bill stipulates that the CO2 has to come from a fossil fuel. And the reason for that is because that's where the money comes from. And this is a really good question. Why not give the money for direct air capture? Because theoretically the money doesn't exist until the taxing of a fossil fuel has taken place. So it could be done. I mean, you could add this to the bill and say, let's give money to people who do direct air capture. But where would the money come from? It has to come from somewhere else. Understand what I'm saying? It doesn't, the money that's taken out of fossil fuels, it either goes to households as a dividend, and we haven't even talked about the dividend yet, or it goes to, as a refund to those who have already emitted the fuel, but the CO2, but put it back into a sequestered form.
How many more questions would you like to do, Rick?
Let's see what time we have right now. I think we got time for 5 more minutes of questions.
All right.
So about 3 more.
3 more?
Let's find somebody who hasn't asked a question in the past. How about the young lady in the red headband there?
Okay, so I just don't understand why the Clean Power Plan is mutually exclusive with the bill that we're trying to pass. It seems to me that if we can have that in place at the same time with our bill, we'll have more supporters in general for our bill.
As you see, the Clean Power Plan, I mean, one way of looking at what the Clean Power Plan has achieved is that it's already achieved its goal. The Clean Power Plan's goal was to get emissions from the electricity sector down to 32% below 2005 levels. We're almost there now, so if you reinstated the Clean Power Plan, it wouldn't have any impact. And this policy, this Energy Innovation Act, would far exceed it. So we're not specifically, the bill doesn't specifically write out the Clean Power Plan. It just says the EPA can't enforce those regulations anymore. I mean, I understand what you're saying. We would have more support from some people and less support from others. We need to find the sweet spot where we get enough support to pass the bill.
Got a question on the side of the room, unless you have more comments on that.
I don't think he can see you.
There we are.
Hi. So I've been doing a lot of reading on climate change for the last 4 months, and one thing I'm seeing are these nonlinear warming loops from the Arctic and the methane coming out from the permafrost and the possibility that trees may start to actually exhale carbon dioxide at some point, and saturation of the oceans and so on and so forth. And I guess I'm thinking these figures around health seem very conservative to me. I mean, it seems to me that we're looking at saving millions of lives. I just saw an article in Condé Nast Traveler that was saying that 90% of species will be gone in 31 years. This was in Condé Nast Traveler, and this wasn't off from any of the articles that I've been reading lately. It was actually kind of confirming to me that the mainstream media was starting to pick up on these nonlinear feedback loops. So there's a part of me that's at this conference sort of thinking, okay, we're being very polite here with this bill, and at the same time, it's like, you know, this is really so urgent. You know, we're looking at a mass extinction of species right now that's ongoing. So I guess I just wanted to say that. And the other thing I wanted to say is that I'm wondering if we could also sort of walk our talk a little bit here in this hotel in terms of like the air conditioning and the plastic cups and the, you know. I came down here and I was freezing, and I just feel like of all people, we could maybe just be conscious of, we don't maybe have to have the air conditioning on so super high. Maybe we could get some Sharpie pens for our plastic cups, or bring any, I didn't bring my water bottle traveling, I didn't think of it, but I will next time. You know, that kind of thing. It just seems a little bit like we're not quite in step, and I understand that we're also busy planning the conference and so on and so forth, but I'm thinking that we really have much less time than we think around the climate crisis. We are, and that's why you see like Extinction Rebellion coming online, you know, which I'm pretty excited about myself. Thank you very much.
Okay, Lesley, you want to make any comments on that?
Sure. So I think you're right, and I'm paraphrasing Jerry here, but I don't think that these things are very difficult to model, and so the economic forecasts, both in terms of health and in terms of cost, are almost certainly quite low, right? They are quite conservative. That said, it's important to our credibility and our conversations with Congress to be able to bring peer-reviewed economic, generally acknowledged studies to their attention. And so that is what our figures are based on, because we do need to have that level of credibility. And I appreciate your comments, particularly about the air conditioning freezing. But yes, our event staff actually works quite hard to make sure that this event is as sustainable and as low carbon as can be. They can't be everywhere at all places to fix everything, but they do. That is top of their agenda when they're putting on this event.
And with that, I think we'll take a break for 15 minutes for those who need a break, because this is a long seminar. So be back here at 3:40, and we'll continue.
All right, guys, a couple public service announcements. The first one is there is a page on the Energy Innovation Act that lists all the data sources for any stats that we're using. It's just /data sources. So if you need to ever wonder where a particular statistic came from, you can go to that page and look for it. And then the second thing is that someone asked if there would be a way for unanswered questions that we didn't get time for in this seminar to be answered. So we will start a thread on community for that purpose. So don't worry if you feel like you didn't get your question answered. We will. I'll make sure Rick types in all the answers. I'll sit next to him and answers your questions. Okay. All right, so we're moving on. We're still on good for people, so we're only on the second benefit. But we're going to start talking about the dividend. Our messaging point around the dividend is that the dividend puts money straight into people's pockets to spend as they see fit. It helps low and middle income people.
So here's how the policy is good for family finances. And this is the first time we said a word about the dividends, that part of the bill, and a very important part of the bill. Okay, tech team. Anybody here from the tech team? One of the TVs is off. Intern. I don't know what to do about that. One of the TVs is off. Don't step on the wires. Yeah, we're going to have to move ahead. So I'm sorry, you might have to step out into the aisle there to see the big screen. Okay, so the Carbon Dividend Trust Fund, Section 9512. Somebody put a 3 here. This is the destination of all the carbon fee and fluorinated gas fee dollars that are collected. It's established by statute as a standalone account. That is, it's not part of general revenue and a separate fund, somewhat like the Social Security Trust Fund. It means it cannot be rated for general revenue to fund any other government programs or functions. Instead, all of the money, all of the net revenue after administrative overhead goes to households. So how much money are we talking about, and how does it get allocated? Here's a simple flow diagram. Carbon fees go into the trust fund. Some of the money gets used for overhead, and the rest goes for dividends. Here's year one with that $15 per metric ton fee. Carbon fees come to about $78 billion. The administrative cost is about $5 billion, so that leaves $73 billion. There it is, $73 billion for households, which is about 93.5%. How about year two, when the carbon fee is $25 plus inflation? The trust fund gets $139 billion. The overhead is still only about, something's getting ahead of me here. Right, okay, gets about 139 billion, 5 billion still for overhead. So that leaves 96.3% for households. And let's see what happens in year 5 when the carbon fee is risen to $55 a metric ton. The carbon fee pool grows to 291 billion. Still only about 5 billion for administrative fees, because remember, the population, it doesn't change. The number of taxpayers and the number of recipients only changes a little bit. So as you can see, as the years go by, it's a larger percentage that goes to households. Now, if you should hear objections to this policy predicated on the claim that carbon taxes will burden American families, you should take note of what we learned in a 2016 household impact study. Who's read the 2016 household impact study? Okay, about half of the group here. It's been a while. Actually, we may have an update on that coming up. But if you look at the chart on the left, and it just shows who the author was and what the name of this is. It's on our website if anyone wants to take a look at it. So if you look at the chart on the left, it breaks down the carbon dividends on average by income quintile. So this is the lowest income, 20%, to the highest income, 20%. Equal groups, equal in population, from the least wealthy to the most. Based on the way people spend their money on energy, that study predicted that the lowest income, 20%, would come out around $280 a head for the year, in that first year. And the wealthiest 20% around $320 behind, with middle income earners a little bit ahead of break even. But here's what's pretty interesting. If you look at this chart, it's expressing the same data, but not in terms of dollars, but in terms of percent of household income. Okay, the annual percent of household income. You can see that the lowest income household, they come out ahead by about 1.8% of their annual income. But the wealthiest Americans are only behind by about 0.2% of their household income. So a typical wealthy family falls short only by a couple tenths of a percent of their income. And of course, they're the ones who can afford to make lifestyle changes to reduce their carbon footprint, to get back in the black if they choose to do so. And the non-wealthy, who may lack those resources, will generally come out ahead regardless. They can spend their money on things that they need, like shoes, or food, or childcare. You see how meaningful this extra money is for a low-income family? CCL has an absolute red line that any climate policy must account for the principle of caring for the most vulnerable among us. And that dividend makes that real. And the politically important middle class, they're coming out slightly ahead or break even. So what this is saying, that solving climate change has zero costs for them. How can that not be a political winner? So we'll see if there's any questions you have about the economic costs right now. Gentleman at the end of the row there in the checked shirt. We need a microphone.
Hi, I was just wondering how often would payouts occur under the carbon fee and dividend?
It's monthly. That's an easy one. How about the young lady with her hand up there and that right over there?
Hi there. Is there a way that you can monitor, or that there will be a monitor or policing of administrative costs, that we don't build some huge bureaucracy in this trust?
The bill does stipulate that I think it's in the first 5 years, it cannot exceed 6% of total revenues, and then after that, it cannot exceed 2%. So it's built into the policy. And we've done some estimates based on comparing it to the IRS budget. All the way in the back there, lady waving her hand. I think when I see hands waving, it means that they have a really good question.
Don't tip people off to your strategy.
Thank you. The member of Congress we're meeting with Tuesday morning has expressed reservations about the effect on small business. Can you talk about that?
You have anything on that?
Yeah, well, we can take business up. We will talk about the economy. We hadn't planned on talking about small business, but I do think that one of the things that businesses will like about this is that it's transparent, so they know what's coming, they know what the price will be and what the increase will be, and they will be able to plan for it, which is a much easier thing than being surprised by increasing costs.
Well, and not to mention the fact that if most small businesses interact with the consumer economy, and consumers are going to have more money to spend. So it depends on whether that small business is in a position to reduce their carbon footprint, to make ends meet, and to take advantage of that money that's in the consumer economy. How about this young lady here right in front of the column there? Push it up. You push the switch up.
I think now it's on, yes.
Okay.
Yeah, you were saying that they're going to get an extra maybe $280, the lowest income people in a year, and that looked really realistic to me in terms of what I've seen, when I worked with with that calculator, the dividend calculator. The person who was talking this morning, right before this started on the international talk, he's talking about like people getting $2,000 a year, and that's just not realistic. And I was wondering, I mean, I know that wasn't you talking, but I'm wondering where this idea that people are going to be getting back like $2,000 over a year, because, I mean, even the calculator, when you come to it, a family, a household with 4 adults, and it only comes up with getting back, maybe $1,200 in a year, something like that. And so I'm wondering where these ideas of these huge dividends are coming from, because they're not that huge.
Okay, the calculator only talks about year one. So as the fee increases, the dividend also increases.
But as the fee increases, the amount of fuel use is going to decrease, and so there's going to be less money coming
Okay.
into the fund.
It takes a long time before before the dividend starts to shrink. How to put this? We've actually calculated, based on the trajectory in the bill, at what point do the dividends kind of top out. And it's after about 17 years when the dividend starts to top out, and then very gradually start to shrink, because the fee goes up faster than the emissions reduction goes down. So over those first 10 years, the number that I didn't see what the gentleman talked about in the monthly call. I haven't seen that yet.
He didn't say when it was.
Yeah, right. And
you're not going to be seeing anything like that.
sure, you'll be. He may have been talking about the total amount of dividend money that you get, not the amount that you exceed your carbon costs. Okay.
The total amount you get isn't that great. Like I say, a family, on the first year, the family with 4 people only gets $108,000 or $108 a month. So that's about $1,200 a year.
Yeah, and after a couple more years, that doubles. Okay, because the fee goes up by 2/3 or 2/3 each year. So it goes up 25, 35, 45, 55. So by year 10, I don't know if we have any think, well, I did show in this. Yeah, this just shows how much goes to households out of that money. Yeah. Okay, gotta go all the way back to where. Okay, the future. I believe this is 5 years or 10 years?
10.
This is 10 years, what the family will get paid. Okay.
Okay, yes, we will put it on a chart. It is on the data sources page.
Yeah, I can actually access some spreadsheets there. I can answer any of these questions about how much a family of 4 will come out ahead, but don't want to do it right now. Yeah, Jay has a good point. And it is there somewhere, but it's not very well displayed. And we are working on an update of the calculator because the bill is slightly different from the policy that the calculator was based on. So we expect later in this summer to have an update to the calculator. Let's take one more question. This gentleman right here, and, right behind Jerry there.
Hi, sorry, this might be a slight two-part question, but I'm curious about, the plus 280 for that bottom quintile. That's pretty important for those folks. It's probably going to reduce poverty, especially deep poverty a lot. I'm curious if there have been calculations along that front, maybe inequality metrics as well. And second, how this is sort of playing in with there's rising interest in universal basic income from Andrew Yang and things like that. I know we sort of try to steer clear of that because it's controversial, but it definitely is a small step toward it. So.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the first part of the question was. How does it?
The impact on poverty measures, like there's the
sure.
supplemental poverty measure, official poverty measure. I think those would
yeah.
both include this.
One thing that you should know, and I don't think we mentioned it in this presentation, is that the bill is written in such a way that even though the dividend is subject to federal income tax, it does not affect means-tested programs. So in terms of, and I'm not sure if this answers your question, but in terms of poverty rates, it would. Yeah, I'm certain that it would reduce the poverty rate. And as far as universal basic income, we're not even going to get into that, but it does have some of the properties of a universal basic income, but it's not intended to fill that gap. We should probably move on because we have quite a bit to go yet. Okay, Lesley?
Okay, we've reached the, good for the economy. Okay, so our main talking point, which we have had since the bill launched, was this policy will create 2.1 million jobs in local communities across America. So that comes from REMI, and Rick is going to talk a little bit about, oh, no, I'm going to keep talking. Okay, that's a lot of jobs. That is the same amount of jobs as if you put everyone in Wyoming, Alaska, and Vermont to work. Danny wanted me to test this. Do you like that? No? Okay. I'm going to tell him that was a losing. Also, that includes children. That's the entire population of the states.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about jobs in a little bit more detail. You know, most people think of clean energy jobs when they're talking about jobs created by climate policy, and it's true. Here are some stats for jobs in climate-friendly businesses that was accumulated by e2.org. This is jobs through 2018, and don't worry, you won't have to memorize these. But 255,000 in clean vehicles, 446,000 in solar and wind, 139,000 in grid and clean storage, and a whopping 2.3 million jobs in energy efficiency. And from that recent report, compare this with the number of people that work in coal mines, and you'll be surprised. This is many times more. Yeah, we don't want to be too rough on coal country. More construction jobs. A lot of those jobs are in the electric power sector. Almost 40% of construction jobs are in the wind and solar sector, are wind and solar in the electric power sector. And more than half of that job growth is in renewable energy. So it's already a job creator. So just think how much more this will be enhanced under a policy that prices carbon fairly. But it ain't just clean energy neither. In addition to jobs in renewable as in energy efficiency, the policy itself creates jobs in other ways. In 2014, that study that was done by REMI, how many people are familiar with the REMI study? Okay, about 2/3. There was a company called Regional Economic Models Incorporated, and we hired them to model a policy close to the current bill, not knowing how it was going to turn out. They took the carbon fee and dividend plan and ran it through their proprietary models, and their report showed strong emissions reduction along with improved job growth. So that's where the 2.1 million jobs in 10 years come from. The net positive job impact is due to the fact that you have what's called revenue recycling, a term for putting money back into the consumer economy. It stimulates household spending, and they found that because of that stimulus, jobs would surge in things like healthcare, construction, retail, information technology, real estate, tourism, and other sectors of the economy that tend to be labor-intensive rather than energy-intensive. Lesley?
Hold on, yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we're all clear on this. So the 2.1 million jobs are the jobs that are attributed to this policy through REMI, and REMI is really the only economic study that models jobs based on a policy. So there is no other economic modeling out there that has modeled job impact. And so we use this statistic from REMI, but it doesn't include the transition to clean energy and jobs that might come with that, that Rick just talked about. And it also does not include innovation. So one of the main reasons that businesses support the Energy Innovation Act is that they know that it will drive innovation. And so you may have heard the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, which is a consortium of the biggest names in Silicon Valley, like Facebook, Google, Microsoft. It's just a consortium of huge companies. It's got other companies in there like United Airlines. This group has made a statement of support in principle for the Energy Innovation Act, and in fact came to the Hill a couple weeks ago and lobbied on the bill. Their statement of support in principle is based on, they have questions about how it will work with California's cap and trade law, but they have no hesitations about supporting the policy itself. And that largely is because they understand the benefits that can come from innovation and the economic benefits of that. And so those benefits are hard to model, and you won't find those effects forecasted or modeled by anyone. But you know, they will be there, and businesses believe they will be there. Whew, okay. So we have, we've always talked about jobs, right? 2.1 million jobs has been our talking point on the economy. But we are moving to, in our testimony to Congress through Jerry, we are moving to discussing economics on a cost-benefit basis. And so we have a little more information to offer in this area, and that's what I'm going to talk about right now. I'm going to go slowly, and then Jerry, if I'm butchering anything, you can step in and correct me. I will say that the $250 billion per year cost, I think, should be $240 billion per year, but that was my mistake. So, what are the costs of climate change? The best peer-reviewed number that we have is for the last decade, climate change has cost the United States $250 billion per year, and that is forecasted to increase to $350 billion per year in the next decade. Now, that doesn't include things like a tipping point or rapidly accelerating things. That's a lot of money. So what could that buy us? It would cost, I looked some stuff up, it would cost us $232 billion each year to repair and build our public schools to the level that they would be safe for children to learn in. It would cost $123 billion to repair every bridge in the US, and $177 billion to repair and upgrade utility transmission lines. So that's money we're spending every year that we could be spending on other things if we were to alleviate the effects of climate change.
Okay, this is mine. So how much does it cost here in the U.S.? Well, of course, Lesley just gave you an idea how much it has cost in the past. And but why? Because climate change contributes to a lot of economic damage because there's a trend and it's not our friend. Thank you, Jerry, for that. We made this chart using data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and it shows that since 1980, billion-dollar weather disasters have quadrupled and economic losses have quintupled, gone up nearly 400%. And if anyone should ask, yes, those costs are adjusted for inflation. And if a skeptic should say, that's just because there are more people and more buildings and more development. Not true. These losses have outpaced population growth by 12 to 1. So these are not the only costs dumped on our economy from climate breakdown, but they are the ones people see most clearly. So slowing the pace of climate change is essential to get these costs under control. Lesley?
All right. So your talking point here is that the economic benefits of the Energy Innovation Act are 4 times greater than the costs. Now, I'm going to do my best to explain it to you. The benefits here are considered, these benefits are each year by 2030, so they are in the future. $250 billion a year of avoided health costs, and there is a range in climate costs from $62 billion to $540 billion. And basically, what is happening here is what you assume the cost of burning carbon dioxide to be. There's a metric called the social cost of carbon that I think Rick is going to talk about a bit. Yeah. And based on whether you think it's low or high is sort of the range you get for the avoided climate costs. So what we have done is taken the smallest number, which is $62 billion, so the most conservative you can be. And then you match that against a small reduction in GDP. And this is a change in what we have used in the past. So we have previously looked to REMI, which forecasts a small increase in GDP, but recent research has suggested that that is an outlier and that there will be some costs associated with a policy like this. And so we're going to use that more recent research as more credible. But the $40 to $80 billion, $48 billion to $80 billion each year is just strictly the cost of the policy. It doesn't, it's not weighed against, it's against business as usual, so it's not weighed against, you know, the opportunity costs of, or the alternative costs of policies, like what of the other thing that we would do if we didn't do this. And so if you take the most conservative benefits and the biggest cost, the benefits are still 4 times the costs of the policy.
Yeah, so this is kind of a way we can summarize this in an easy talking point. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the social costs of carbon. It's worth noting that these costs don't accrue to each country in isolation. And here's a little bit of a paper that was also in Nature that talks about this is from scientists in the US and Italy. It estimated that a ton of carbon pollution causes $48 in damage just in the US, but costs the world overall much more, no matter where it's emitted. So this map shows the approximate cost to each country. So in India, the social cost of carbon costs about $86 a metric ton. In the U.S., it's less because we have less damage in the U.S. than they do in India, where there's a lot more impacts from heat and from flooding. In China, they suffer less in damage, mainly because their economy is so much smaller. But so, you know, if there were no other people on Earth except us, we could legitimately set a U.S. carbon fee at $48. But that's clearly not the case, and the harm to people in other countries from our emissions adds up to about $417 per metric ton. And that cost is real because we live in a globally interconnected economy. It's not a zero-sum game. Whether the cost consequences come to us in the form of disease or conflict or something unforeseen, they are real. So once again, tackling climate change is an economic winner, and we've got to get that message across. So,
Sorry,
questions?
one public announcement. So Jerry Hinkle will be doing a breakout session on this tomorrow. So if you're interested in learning more about the economic impact and where these figures come from and how to think about it, he is talking tomorrow at 11:55 in Palladium.
Okay. I'll take just a couple questions so we can get back on track. The young lady in the row right there. Yeah. Somebody's coming.
So you gave $48 per metric ton of cost of carbon in the U.S. Do you have a price for a cost of a gallon of gas? Yeah, that we could tell our members of Congress. Is there some extrapolation on that?
Okay, a gallon of gas emits about 25 pounds of carbon, of CO2, I should say. So 25, divide that by 2,205 pounds, that tells you what percentage of a metric ton it is, and multiply that by the fee. Okay. 25 pounds divided by 2,205, that gives you what fraction of a ton that gallon of gas gives off, and then multiply it by the carbon fee in any given year, $15 and on up. And I guess there's a gentleman way in the back there. I don't think that's got a chance to ask a question. That would tell you what the cost of burning a gallon of gas is in terms of, well, if you use that $48, then that would be the...
it's about 45 cents, right?
That would be the cost in the U.S. Now, if you wanted to use the total cost worldwide, you multiply that fraction by $412, I think.
Okay, my question, Rick, is of the 2.1 million jobs gained, is that net, or is there a negative side of jobs lost?
That's net. That's net.
That's net. Okay, thank you.
Okay, we should probably move on because we're getting close to the end. Because we got a couple other things to talk about.
All right.
I'm going to let Lesley start with bipartisanship.
Bipartisan. All right, Republicans, Democrats, and Republicans are both on board co-sponsoring this together. We have one. We all know. We have one Republican co-sponsor.
Sorry to make you run.
Okay.
I know that.
Do you like
They're
our
laughing
graphic?
at the picture.
Yeah, this is really only for social media, but I put it on our slide because I thought we all needed it to feel good. Okay, so the rest of the talking point is that a majority of Americans want Congress to work together to solve climate change, including a majority of Republicans. And that's still true, even though we only have one Republican co-sponsor. And so one of the things, we hope to get more, obviously. We're seeing some good indicators that we're getting the right pieces into place of support. And so Trout Unlimited, which is an outdoor organization, a grassroots outdoor organization for cold water fishing, has given a statement of support. And this organization carries a lot of weight in a lot of conservative congressional offices in those areas, as well as the conservatives for responsible stewardship. So we're seeing some good signals. Can you go to the next slide? Okay. And this information actually was collected by the Climate Leadership Council, but these statements of support were for a description of a policy that basically very similar to our policy description. So it has the support of a lot of economists, former Federal Reserve chairs, 27 Nobel laureate economists, and 15 former chairs of the Council of Economic Advisors. That includes the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors for the prior 3 Republican presidents. So there are some pieces aligning that are indicative of bipartisan support.
Okay, so people do ask, and it's a legitimate question, why does bipartisanship matter? It's hard enough just to get Republicans and Democrats to talk to each other, let alone sell them a policy they both can support. So why not just get behind one party, put all your energy there, and try to make it happen that way? There's a good reason, and it's not to win some kind of nice people award, but a down and dirty truth. You can see in this list of big legislative achievements that have changed our society and changed history. The Social Security Act, the law that established NATO, the Clean Air Act that has cleaned up our environment so much, the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty that may have prevented a thermonuclear war, the Civil Rights Act, Medicare and Medicaid, the Endangered Species Act, which was passed just months before Nixon was forced out of office, but he signed it. The Clean Air Act amendments that give the EPA the authority to regulate CO2. All of these, none of these would have become law without bipartisan votes, not one of them. So it's not because, like I said, we want to prove what nice people we are. It's because no policy will endure the political battles of the future unless both parties have skin in the game. So great, we have a reason to pursue bipartisanship. It's a tongue twister. But how can it happen? We start by posing 2 questions. What do voters want? And what do politicians think voters want? I'm going to play a clip from a lecture by one of our monthly call guests, Dr. Celia Paris, who spoke in February 2018. Let's see if I can make this work.
It is great to be here tonight with all of you. So to just review a couple of the points from the previous call. So my research is looking at, does the public actually care about bipartisanship and cooperation across the aisle in Congress? So there were a couple of points that I raised when thinking about this question. And I think a few things that we really can learn from public opinion research that are helpful when thinking about the public's interest in things like bipartisanship. The first thing that you need to know is that cues drive public opinion. So for most people, politics and policy issues are not at the top of their daily priorities. They're not paying a ton of attention to politics often. They sometimes struggle when asked questions about sort of not just the details of policy, but even sort of who's in office and what they're doing in office. So because of this, because people are busy, they've got a lot going on in their lives, and they may not always have a lot of knowledge about politics or policy, they rely on what we call cues or shortcuts to help them figure out which policies would benefit people like them. So some of the most common cues are the positions taken by political parties. People often, if their party is supporting a policy, people view that as a pretty good sign that that policy is going to likely benefit people like them. Similarly, for people who support a specific politician, you could think of this as supporters of President Obama or now supporters of President Trump, are also often inclined to support the policy positions taken by these leaders. Again, because this sort of simplifies the process of figuring out what policies will actually be in their interest. Now, this doesn't mean that attitudes towards policy don't matter. They do, especially if they're strong. So if people have a clear, strong sense, just right off the bat from hearing about a policy, hey, this sounds good, or this sounds really bad, that matters. And if you tell people what politicians support, while also giving them information about the policy that's really clear, then their attitudes toward the policy still do matter in that context. But in a lot of cases, especially when we're talking about, you know, the type of complicated bills that Congress is usually taking up that have a lot of different components, cues really have a powerful effect for that because people have a hard time thinking about all of those different pieces. And so once debate really gets started, it makes a big difference how politicians line themselves up, whether they're sort of pro or con, whether they're pro or opposed to a given bill. So people are still really looking to see what stance politicians are going to take. And this is important to know that because cues like a legislator's position on not just climate change, but also on what kind of policies might help climate change and what they sort of indicate by the groups they join, like the Climate Solutions Caucus, have the potential to matter a lot for public opinion. We know people are looking to politicians to figure out what policies would be beneficial. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I wanted to highlight in my talk was that because we don't have a clear sense of how strongly people feel about bipartisanship, because we know people say they like it in polls, but also we see so much partisanship around us, that really calls into question how serious people are in their supposed desire for cooperation. So because of that, it's really helpful to look at how people react to specific examples of bipartisan cooperation to see if in reality they then like politicians better when they act in a bipartisan way on real policy issues. So in my research to test this, I had two different studies, each of which addressed a different sort of complicated policy issue. One was unemployment and the other was immigration. And I had people read a story about a policy debate in Congress on each of these issues. I was choosing fairly non-controversial policies that get a lot of public support. And I was looking to really disentangle how people react to the same policy when it's supported by a bipartisan coalition versus a partisan group, so just the Republicans or just Democrats in Congress. And I wanted to really differentiate that from the tone of the debate, so whether members of Congress are being polite to each other or being kind of disrespectful, and whether the bill passes or fails. Because it could be that people like bipartisanship, but that's only because they associate it with politeness. So if you control for that in a debate, you might find that people don't care that much about it. But that's not what I found. I found that bipartisanship does matter. And it matters in a couple different ways. It gives people a lot more confidence in Congress when they see a bill that has bipartisan sponsorship. And additionally, the way they think about the bill is different. So if they see a bill supported by their own party, and if they see a bill supported by a bipartisan coalition, even if those actually have the same exact policies, people are going to support it about the same amount in each case, and they're going to see it as ideologically similar. And you might say, well, of course, it's the same bill, but that actually doesn't happen if they think the bill is supported only by the other party. In that case, they view that bill as much more ideologically extreme, and they are less inclined to support it. So that really tells us that when people are looking at a bill that only has the support of one party, half the population is, or roughly half the population is seeing that bill as potentially suspect, as potentially extreme, and less likely to be beneficial. So, you know, so that partisan bill, it potentially loses you half the population. And I think that really highlights why bipartisanship can be beneficial. Let's hit the next slide, Brett. Yeah, so, and then it's not even just limited to how people think about the policy or the bill at issue or about Congress. It also has these very tangible benefits for the specific representative. So specifically, people who are from the opposite party as a legislator like that legislator a lot better when that person engages in bipartisan cooperation. And people from the same party are sort of indifferent. They don't really care if that legislator is part of a bipartisan coalition or if that legislator is just working with their own party. Now, there is one exception I found to this, which is minority voters on immigration issues seem to react negatively to bipartisan compromise. And I think some of that might be their perception of the risk of trade-offs in a bipartisan group And so I think, with issues that really hit very close to home for folks that are very personal, you could potentially see penalties if people are worried that they're going to be sold out through bipartisan sponsorship. But most issues are not necessarily like that. And I would venture to say I don't think climate change is an issue that's like that. I think it's more like unemployment, which is to say this is an issue that for most people, it's a big, broad social problem. And I think I think there's a little bit of a difference there. And I will also say that folks see the legislator who acts in a bipartisan way as somebody who's actually listening to the views of voters and to the arguments of other representatives. And in some cases, I found this even makes them view that representative as less self-interested, which is big. We know people tend to think of politicians as very self-interested. So the takeaway from all of this, when we're thinking about legislators and members of Congress, is that bipartisanship can really benefit their reputation with a fairly low risk of costs, and it also increases support for the specific bill in question.
So, one interpretation of this lesson is what Dr. Paris calls, she calls it elite cues, but I know some people don't like to use the word elite, so let's call them leadership cues. The cues often are used by the public to determine where they stand on complex issues. You could even make an analogy to climate feedbacks by calling this a philosophical feedback. The public perceives a policy a certain way. The leader or the elected representative sees what the public is thinking and thinks that's what they want to hear. So it could be a positive feedback in a sense. They get that position reflected back to them from the voters, and they feel that that's the way they should go. So if there's a perceived popularity, people tend to think if other people they identify with support a policy, they're more inclined to support it themselves. So this is how we can defuse the ideological divide on climate issue. And I think we've seen a lot of this happening already. If you look back 5 years or 10 years before CCL started doing its work with the media and with legislators, it was only a few years ago that no Republican would even utter the words climate change. Now, that's changed quite a bit. It hasn't brought about the policy we want, but it's definitely a big step in the right direction. And we've got to continue pressing in that regard. Okay, now revenue neutral.
Revenue neutral. So this is our last benefit. So the government will not keep any of the fees collected, so the size of the government will not grow.
Okay, so we like to use this term. For a long time, CCL was actually presenting the carbon fee and dividend as a revenue-neutral carbon tax. How many people feel confident that they know what revenue neutrality means? Not that big of a percentage. Let me show you what a legal dictionary says it means. It means a policy that neither increases nor decreases tax revenue when compared to existing law. And this is similar but not identical to deficit neutral, which is something that's important to lawmakers because of a 2010 law called the Pay-As-You-Go Act, which, while it's not explicitly mentioned in the bill, is implicitly important to the passage. Because revenue neutral means it doesn't change the amount of taxes the government collects, and deficit neutral means it doesn't increase the deficit. But besides the most committed policy wonks, and of course the Congressional Budget Office, or the CBO, who cares? Conservatives who don't like bigger government. We like to say this policy doesn't grow government. Deficit hawks in both parties who don't want the government to be taking on more federal debt. That's where we want to ensure that the CBO affirms it doesn't increase the deficit. And the third group I'll call pragmatists, who could be, there could be some overlap, but these are people who think government should not be picking the winners. Ooh, pop that P. Picking the winners and losers. And I put an asterisk here because people might think that these are similar, but they're not exactly the same. So we need to check all the boxes for these three groups, and let's talk about that. For conservatives, as I'm defining them here as small government conservatives, government doesn't keep, which means spend, the money that comes in. Government never actually keeps any money. They spend it in one way or another, but this means pretty much the same thing to conservatives. Markets are allowed to function, which means that even though the government is collecting a tax, government is not creating some kind of new department of decarbonization with it. And taxpayers control their own decisions. Government is not dictating what kind of car you get to buy or how you choose to live your life, or even what kind of light bulbs you can buy, so on. Now, for deficit hawks, we can say that the policy does not increase the deficit. And that's absolutely true because the bill spells out that all the operating expenses come from the carbon fee money that's collected. And it's also compliant with the pay-as-you-go law of 2010, which is why the bill designates the dividend as regular income. That's important to the bill sponsors because the CBO will score the policy, and their view has always been that a new tax will suppress the payment of other taxes to the Treasury, requiring an offset of between 20 and 25%. So we've been assured by our sponsors that taxing the dividends will take care of that. And finally, the pragmatists, who are not necessarily motivated by either the size of government or the deficit, but just like the fact that technology decisions are being made by technologists, investment decisions are being made by investors, not by bureaucrats or politicians who would be making their decisions not with their money, but with your money. That's why plowing the money back into the private economy brings about economic efficiency, which simply means that how much decarbonization do you get per dollar spent? It's always going to be more when it forces investors to risk their own money rather than taxpayer money. So this is the last thing we covered. I think we have time for some more Q&A. What time is it? Yeah, we got about 15 minutes for more questions. Brian. Oh, yeah, I'm always, I like to keep the intern running from one end to the other. Right here.
This might be a question more for Lesley or possibly even Jerry, but I know that when I give presentations and I don't have sources cited, I've been nailed to the wall by both conservatives and progressives on this issue. So the stats, like the 14,000 deaths from pollution, I was just curious why some of those stats are not sourced on the slide itself.
Yeah, so we can go back and source them. They come from an infographic where yes, we could put them on the slides. They are all on the energyinnovationact.com/data sources page. Just so you know, yes, all of our data sources are on that page.
We'll get them into the slides. Let's try this gentleman in the sports coat so the microphone doesn't have to go as far.
The amount of money that comes back to citizens is not adjusted for the increase in energy costs, right? That's just the flat-out money you're sending back.
That's correct.
So the net, so somebody's saying, look, they're going to get $280 a year or they get $2,000 a year. It's not what they're going to get net.
Right, the net is going to be whatever everybody gets the same dividend, but how much they pay in increased costs is going to depend on how they live their lives, right? So I hope that answers your question. The gentleman right next to him.
There was talk about the raises in employment, that 2.1 million that was projected, and how that would be much more than the loss of employment, let's say, for coal. If I recall correctly, it's around 5,000 people that work specifically directly in coal in the United States. 70, oh, much more. Okay.
Yeah, it's
I'm
more
hearing
than-
numbers of much more, so let's ignore
I think
that part.
in the state of Illinois, it was 3,200 or something like that. But
Okay, well, regardless, my question is, how do you explain that to people with them not just coming back and saying, well, you can't tell those people to get out of work. You can't tell them, sorry, your industry's dying, go get training somewhere else.
Yeah.
Because I've met that a lot.
where are you from?
Well, not in my direct area, just
Okay.
in discussions I've had.
But you, in discussions, yeah.
Yeah.
Anybody here from Coal Country Group? No, okay. Yeah, it's an excellent question. What do you do to affected industries? And so far, there is nothing in the bill to address that. And we're certainly open to seeing something brought into effect to take care of that. I mean, you're talking about a lot of money, hundreds of billions of dollars. I just can't tell you that there's anything in the bill right now to address it, but there could very well be. And I think that those who have members of Congress in those affected states should discuss it with them. Right here. Yeah, the question is, are the dividends taxed as income? They are taxed as regular income. If they weren't, there would have to be about a 22%, I think is the latest haircut, they call it, taken right off the top from the revenue and given back to the Treasury because of these complicated formulas that the CBO uses. But we tax it as regular income. And that's another reason that it's a very progressive policy, because people at low income pay much lower federal income tax. And so it does tend to shift the burden more towards those who at the higher income. And it would not be counted towards means-tested programs. So you're not going to say, oh, if I get this dividend, it's going to knock me out of Medicaid. You know, that's not going to happen. Let's try with somebody back there, the young lady with her hand up. Okay, yeah, right there. Oh,
Yes,
go
hi.
on.
I give workshops on this in Rhode Island, and it's not the fiscal part I'm talking about, it's the bipartisan. When I show that slide from the presentation, and people see 41 Democrats and 1 Republican, it's a very hard explanation. When I'm standing up there, I get several questions. And to say that this group and that group, supports it, it's still, they're just seeing Democrats. How do you propose I respond?
Oh, boy.
I'm sorry,
Take a
but it's a
shot.
reality.
That's a
It
hard one.
really
I'll let
is.
Lesley answer it.
Maybe I should just get rid of that slide completely.
No, I mean, I think that that everybody feels that way, right? We all wish we had more Republicans on it. Let's start with, it's just really not easy being bipartisan. It's harder, right? But and it requires a leap of faith that there is room in the center for this, right? Even though right now it feels like things are really far apart, but that is a good strategy to stay the course on. So yeah, I guess we would say, well, first of all, we're working on getting.
Did the battery run out? Yeah, we can go.
So yeah, I mean, I would say we're working on getting more, and I think we can point to the movement that has been made by the party. It is starting to shift. There are an increasing number of Republicans who are publicly saying that we have to do something about this, and meaning government action. And so it's requiring a little bit of keep the faith, maybe longer than you would like, but things are changing, and it can be hard to see that from where we are.
I want to add too that think back to the slide that I showed about why we have to do this. So it's not a matter of, well, let's give up because we only have 1 Republican. We really need to do this. And so somebody once said, we're doing this not because it's easy, but because it's hard. Well, there you go. The gentleman over there.
Yes, I'm a conservative with lots of economics education.
Uh-oh.
I am also someone who doesn't like a lot of national debt, because I see it as a real danger for the country. I'm also a pragmatist. So why am I here? What convinced me? Market-based. Let the price signals make the choices and allow people to make the choices that are going to be best. Revenue neutral. We don't like government growing. This is the answer to that. Border adjustment. Doesn't put any of the businesses out of competition with foreign companies. It's the package that many of us have been looking for. Use those lines, it works.
Thanks. Let's try the gentleman with his hand up in this right side here. My right.
Hello. Again, I'm part of the Conservative Caucus as well, and it's incredibly disappointing that we don't have more Republican congressmen signing on, and we're working on it. But if you want to talk the bipartisanship, go back to the authorship. You can point out the Climate Leadership Council. You can point to George Shultz and James Baker being behind this plan. Go back to the carbon fee and dividend. So you can, if you're talking to conservatives, talking to Republicans, you can point to a lot of conservative backing for this plan. And as the other gentleman pointed out, revenue neutral, border fee and adjustment, market-based. This, I hate to say it out loud to a crowd like this, this is a conservative solution. And my background is also economics. This is the first plan I've seen in 40 years that aligns with good environmental economic principles. Also go back to the slide you showed earlier by the economist statement. That was bipartisan. The former former head of the Federal Reserve from both parties. So there is a lot of bipartisan support for this. We don't see it in our congressional representatives yet, but we're working on it.
Peter? Same people.
Thanks, and great presentation, both of you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
So I totally agree with the last statement, but I think part of the problem is that people don't go into politics to watch idly while $1 trillion marches by and they don't get their fingers on it. They're expected to bring home the bacon to their district, right? They've got to go fight for their district and bring home something. And I think that's part of the inherent problem with making it revenue neutral. Why should the politicians be enthusiastic about, not being able to bring something home?
Well, we've got 41 who figured that out. We just need more. And I also want to point out that this bill was introduced at the end of January. To have 41 sponsors on any bill in less than 6 months is really remarkable. That's what I hear from the Washington office. So you got to give hats off to them and hats off to all our volunteers for bringing people on at this rate. We're talking about a policy that's equal to all those that I showed, the Social Security, Clean Air Act, in terms of its impact on our economy and on our society. So it takes a lot of work to overcome those, as Peter said, that resistance to signing onto a bill that's not going to bring my district more than the next guy's district. It takes a lot of work. Bob Archer back there. You heard from another economist here.
Bipartisanship. I look at it as the tip of the iceberg. CCL tells us of all the lobbying that we do, that the trend is clearly moving year after year towards greater support, including among Republicans, that there are a lot who are ready for, quote unquote, as Danny says, the jailbreak. You look at the surveys of Republicans under 35, it is very strongly towards climate change action. So I think we have a strong case to make of the trends. Consider 2.5 years ago, when I'm not a scientist, was what we heard in some of these meetings. So I think when you talk with Democrats, liberals, et cetera, as I do a lot, we were going to have as much trouble getting them on board under a carbon tax policy and a dividend policy, which puts the money back into households, as we are getting conservatives on board.
Okay, we still have about, you want to add anything to that? We have about, no, let's take one more question, I think. Now, let's just take one more question. Somebody who hasn't asked a question yet. Are there any of you out there? All the way in the back, a lady is waving her hands.
Thank you. Hi. I want to go back to the economic costs of climate change, and that you're taking this to testimony now because there are a lot of problems happening. Do you ever use the term risk management?
Oh, yes,
And
that's a good one.
just talk about that, because that seems like something people understand at a very, personal level.
Yeah, that's something that the pragmatists on our list would also understand. And I just want to pitch a little bit. I worked in engineering, in energy research, and we did a lot of large-scale tests that, with very hazardous and difficult projects, pilot plant projects, and we did something called a hazard operability study. Anybody here know what that means? Ever heard of a HAZOP? There you go, there's an engineer. That may have been a process engineer. And we had to go through every single valve, pipe, controller, vessel, and imagine what kind of things could happen that would kill people or blow your plant up, and make sure that there were things that were done to mitigate that risk. So this is risk management at its most extreme. And if you look at the whole world as a big chemical process plant, that's what we need to be looking at. And you're right, we did not include that in our presentation, but it is something that I think will appeal to a lot of people. Anything to add? I think that's still not working.
Sorry, I forgot. I would say, so Jerry Hinkle is the one who has provided the testimony on behalf of CCL. The figures that he uses are largely in line with what we presented today, but definitely go to his session and tomorrow and see. You can ask him that question.
Okay, we have 6 minutes left. Should we wrap it up?
Yep. All right.
Okay, I think we're going to wrap it up now. Everyone, thanks for coming. And, we hope you learned something, and we certainly learned a lot from you. And enjoy the rest of the conference, and see you all tomorrow.